He paid gold for a stranger. She dug a grave with her bare hands just to show him what her life had been worth. What happened next on that mountain will stay with you long after the snow melts. If you've ever watched someone be treated like they had no value, like their existence was an inconvenience, then this story is going to hit differently. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction started at noon, which was generous, because by 12:30 it had turned into something uglier than a cattle sale. Black Hollow had always been a settlement that operated on its own rules. Technically, it sat inside territorial boundaries. Technically, there were laws that applied. But the nearest marshal's office was 4 days south by horseback, and out here, 4 days might as well have been 4 lifetimes. What Black Hollow operated on was simpler than law. What you could take, you kept. What you couldn't defend, you lost. And what stood on that platform in the mud and frozen slush outside Garner's trading post at noon on a Tuesday in late November was a young woman who had nothing left to defend. Her name was Ilara Voss, though nobody in the crowd knew that yet. They didn't need to. Names weren't the point. She was 23 years old, and she stood with her wrists bound loosely in front of her. Not because she was dangerous, but because it was procedure. Because Harlan Duff, who ran the trading post and organized these particular arrangements with the cheerful detachment of a man selling wagon wheels, felt it added a certain officiousness to the proceedings. She wasn't trying to run. She had nowhere to run to. She was wearing a coat that had been somebody else's 3 owners ago, patched at both elbows and missing 2 buttons at the collar, and her dark hair was pulled back in a knot that had started tight and loosened over the course of the morning into something that hung sideways at her neck. Her boots were too big. Her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, not pretty enough to warrant any extra bids, Duff had already calculated. He'd set the opening at 4 silver coins, which was low. He wasn't sentimental about it. She was small, probably not good for heavy labor, and the bruising along her jaw from whatever situation had deposited her at his door 3 days prior made her look like trouble somebody had already decided wasn't worth keeping. The crowd that gathered numbered about 30 men and a handful of women who stood at the fringe with their arms folded, watching with expressions that mixed disgust and resignation in roughly equal measure. Disgust because this was ugly, and they knew it. Resignation because Black Hollow had been doing ugly things for a long time, and nobody had stopped it yet. "Starting bid, 4 silver, Duff called out. He had a good voice for it, booming, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd done this before and expected to do it again. Strong back, young enough to be useful for a good few seasons. Any takers? A man near the front of the crowd, heavy-set, wearing a fur-trimmed coat that smelled like smoke and something souring underneath, lifted 2 fingers. 4 from Aldrich, looking for 5. Any 5? A laugh from somewhere in the back. She don't look worth 4. More laughter. Alara's eyes moved across the crowd, and then she looked at a point just above their heads, at something nobody else was looking at. She had learned over a number of years that the most useful thing she could do during moments like this was to find something that was not a human face and concentrate on it. A roofline, a patch of gray sky, the way frost clung to the wood of Duff's sign above the door. She found the frost. She concentrated on the frost. 4 going once, 450. The new voice belonged to a woman named Susanna Kraft, who ran a laundry operation 2 streets over and occasionally bought workers she then rented out at a margin. She was efficient about it, and she wasn't especially cruel, which in Black Hollow passed for mercy. 450 from Susanna, any 5? She'll be dead before spring at the laundry, someone called. Look at those arms. My money, my concern, Susanna said flatly. 5, said Aldrich, without looking at Susanna. The bidding moved slowly. It had that particular quality of a transaction nobody was excited about, the back and forth of men spending money out of stubbornness rather than genuine want, the kind of bidding that wasn't really about the thing being sold, but about not letting the other man win. Alara watched the frost on the sign. Someone had hammered the sign in crooked years ago, and nobody had corrected it. She thought about that. She thought about what kind of man hammers a sign crooked and walks away from it. She was at 7 silver, Aldrich and a younger man named Cook trading increments of 50, when the crowd shifted. He came around the side of the trading post on a horse that moved the way he did, deliberately, without ceremony, the kind of pace that said this animal had covered serious ground today and would cover more before dark. The man himself was big in the way mountains are big, not designed to impress, just constructed with too much material. He was somewhere north of 40, with a beard that had long since stopped being styled, and become simply a feature of his face like his nose or his brow. His coat was elk hide, worn through at the right shoulder, and repaired with a different leather so you could see the history of it. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard, a knife on his belt, and another knife that she would only notice later tucked into the outside of his left boot. Gideon Mercer had come to Black Hollow for 3 things: ammunition, salt, and a new saw blade, because his old one had cracked clean through 2 weeks prior and he was losing too much to hand cutting. He had not come to watch an auction. But he had arrived at the wrong moment from the wrong direction, and now he was sitting on his horse at the edge of a crowd and understanding piece by piece what he was seeing. He sat there for a moment, just watching. He had seen things like this before. Not exactly like this. Black Hollow had a particular flavor, but the architecture of it was familiar. The platform, the rope at the wrists, the man with the carrying voice, the crowd that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable enough to leave. He had ridden past these situations before in his younger years, on the logic that a man who inserted himself into every piece of ugliness he encountered would not live long enough to be useful to anyone. He was older now, and his logic on the subject had not become cleaner. It had just become harder to act on. $7.50, Cook said. $7.50 from Cook. Any 8? Aldrich scratched his jaw. 8. The younger man hesitated. In that hesitation, Gideon watched Alara's face. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were still fixed on something above the crowd. But her hands, her bound hands, were clenched tight enough that the knuckles had gone white. And he could see it from here, the way the rope bit in slightly as she pressed her wrists together. Not struggling, just holding. Just holding. Do I have $8.50? The crowd was losing interest. Cook shook his head. A few men drifted toward the warmth of the trading post interior. 8 going once. 8 going 20. The crowd went quiet in a way crowds rarely go quiet. Not the polite pause of social decency, but the sudden, startled silence of people who have heard something that doesn't fit the scene they're standing in. Heads turned. Someone laughed, then cut it short when they realized nobody was joining them. Duff stared at the man on the horse. Beg your pardon? 20 gold, Gideon said. His voice was flat. Not loud. He wasn't performing anything. He said it the same way he might have said the price of salt at a counter. You heard me. The silence stretched. 20 gold coins was not a sum that changed hands in an auction like this. It was 2, maybe 3 times what Alara would have sold for by the end of the bidding, and everyone present understood that this number did not come from a calculation about labor, or usefulness, or seasons of work. Nobody paid 20 gold for those things. Duff recovered faster than most. He was a businessman, and 20 gold was 20 gold regardless of its source. 20 gold from... He squinted at the man on the horse. From the gentleman on the gray. Nobody bid against it. In the end, it took less than 2 minutes. The coin changed hands. Gideon dismounted, walked to Duff's table, and counted out the coins with a patience that suggested he was in no hurry and had done things requiring more patience than this. Duff cut the rope at Alara's wrists. Somebody in the crowd made a comment that Gideon chose not to hear, and he turned and looked at the man until the man looked somewhere else. He walked back to his horse. He didn't look at Alara directly, not yet. He just moved to stand beside his horse and check the saddle cinch, which was fine because he'd already checked it. He was giving her a moment. He wasn't sure why he was giving her a moment, but it seemed like the right thing to do. She walked toward him. Her boots squelched in the mud. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with an expression that was not grateful or frightened or confused. It was simply watchful, the face of a person who had learned that the gap between one bad situation and the next was often just a matter of who was holding the rope. You got a horse? He asked. No. You'll ride behind me then. It's a long way and the weather's turning. She looked up at the sky. He was right about the weather. The clouds had been building since morning, gray and swollen, and the wind had that particular edge to it that people who lived through northern winters learned to recognize, the kind that meant you should be inside before dark and somewhere defensible before midnight. Where are you taking me? She asked. Mountain, he said. I got a cabin. And then what? He looked at her for the first time squarely. She held his gaze without flinching. He noticed the bruising along her jaw. He noticed that her coat was not enough for the weather that was coming. "Then we get out of this storm," he said. "That's all." It wasn't a reassurance. He hadn't meant it as one. It was just the truth of the next 8 hours. He didn't lie to himself enough to know what came after 8 hours. She stared at him for another moment. Then, without a word, she moved to the side of the horse and waited. He made a step with his hands. She took it and swung up behind him. The horse, a steady gray gelding named nothing in particular because Gideon didn't name horses, adjusted to the weight and kept still. Gideon mounted and turned the horse north toward the trailhead that climbed into the Aldrin Range, into the white and the cold and the gathering dark. Nobody in the crowd said anything as they left. Some watched. Most had already turned back to their own business by the time the horse and 2 riders reached the edge of the settlement and disappeared behind the first tree line. The storm came faster than either of them expected, which was not unusual. The Aldrin Range had its own weather and its own schedule, and it owed nobody a warning. What started as a stiff wind and a scattering of flakes by mid-afternoon became, by late afternoon, a proper assault. Horizontal snow, visibility down to 30 yards, wind cold enough to reach through elk hide and into the bones beneath. Gideon kept his pace steady. He knew this trail in a way that had nothing to do with sight. He'd walked it in darkness, in mud season, in the disorientating whiteout conditions of a full mountain blizzard. He knew it in his feet, in the way the horse's balance shifted on certain grades, in the particular creak of the spruce trees to his left when the trail bent northeast. He kept his head down, and he rode. Elara sat behind him without speaking. She held on to the back of his coat, not clutching, just holding enough to keep her balance. And he could feel the cold radiating off her even through the layers between them. Her coat was a disaster. He could tell from the way she was shaking, the kind of shaking that starts in the core and moves outward. Not fear shaking, cold shaking, the particular rhythm of a body that is losing the fight against temperature and knows it. About an hour into the ride, he pulled his scarf from around his neck. It was long, thick, made from mountain goat wool by a woman in a settlement further east who made them to last, and passed it back to her without looking. She didn't take it immediately. "You'll get cold," she said. Her voice was controlled but tight. "I run warm," he said. "Take it." Another moment. Then she took it. He heard the small sound of her pulling it around her, felt the shift in her balance behind him as she arranged it. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer. It wasn't coldness. He just didn't have a response that wasn't either dismissive or falsely warm, and neither seemed right, so he said nothing and rode. The cabin was another hour beyond that, tucked into a fold of the mountain below the tree line. Not hidden exactly, but positioned the way a man with good instincts positions things he wants to keep. Sheltered from the north wind by a ridge, facing south toward the best light, surrounded on 3 sides by forest dense enough to break a storm, but not so dense as to hide an approach. He had built most of it himself over 4 years, adding and reinforcing season by season, and it showed in the way things slightly didn't match. Different wood grain in the extension he'd added the second winter, mismatched stones in the chimney where he'd run out of one type and switched to another. It was functional rather than beautiful, and he would have said that was fine by him, because beauty was not a criterion he applied to structures built for survival. He got down first, tied the horse at the post, then reached up a hand to help her down. She took it briefly, landed on both feet, and immediately let go. The snow was 3 inches deep here and falling hard. "Get inside," he said. "Door's not locked." He was right. He never locked it. He had thought, when he first built the cabin, that this was probably an oversight, and then he had considered who was likely to come up this mountain in the middle of winter to rob a trapper who had nothing worth stealing, and the answer was nobody with the sense to find their own way home. So the door stayed unlocked. She pushed it open and went in. He dealt with the horse, rubbed it down, got it into the lean-to shelter on the north side of the cabin that served as a minimal stable, made sure it had water that wasn't frozen and enough feed to last the night. By the time he came inside, Elara had found the fireplace. She hadn't lit it. There was still the char of a fire from 2 days ago, cold now, and wood stacked beside it. But she was crouching in front of it with her hands on the andirons like someone who'd been telling herself for hours that fire was coming and had finally gotten close enough to believe it. There's kindling in the box, he said. I see it. She was already reaching for it. He let her. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door and looked at the cabin through her eyes for a moment, trying to see what she was seeing. It was one main room, the fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a sleeping platform built into the far wall with a wool blanket folded on it, shelves along the south wall with sorted stores, dried meat, flour, salt, dried beans, cooking equipment in a row. His tools hanging near the door. A second shelf, lower, with books. He read more than most trappers, and he'd stopped apologizing for it. A window on the south wall shuddered against the storm. She got the fire going in less time than he'd expected. She had done this before. The kindling caught, and then the split log she'd set on top of it, and the light changed in the room from the gray-white of the storm outside to the warmer, unsteady orange of fire. She sat back on her heels and looked at the fire for a moment. "Thank you," she said again. Still controlled, still tight. "Stop thanking me," he said, but without heat. He was hanging up his wet outer layer and moving to the shelf for the cooking pot. "You want something hot?" "I'm fine." "You were shaking for the last 2 hours." "I'm not shaking now." He looked at her. She wasn't. She was sitting in front of the fire with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she was right. The shaking had stopped, which either meant she'd warmed up faster than he thought, or she'd decided she was done letting him see it. He suspected the latter. "I'm making broth," he said. "You don't have to want it." He made it anyway. Dried venison, melted snow, a little salt. He had good salt. He'd bought it that morning before everything went sideways. That felt like a different day already. He set the pot on the fire hook and pulled one of the chairs close and sat, not across from her but at an angle, which was less confrontational, and he was aware of that choice without analyzing it too deeply. She moved from the floor to the second chair eventually, when the fire had gotten going properly, and the room had taken on some warmth. She didn't position herself close to him. She sat with the fire between them in a way that wasn't quite deliberate, but wasn't quite accidental either. They were quiet for a while. Outside, the storm had found its full voice. The wind in the chimney, the creak of the structure, the occasional sharper sound of a branch somewhere taking the weight of it. "I can sleep on the floor," she said. Not offering, just stating. "There's a pallet," he said. He meant the folded blanket on the sleeping platform. "I'll sleep there. You take the platform." She frowned. "That's your bed." "Pallet's fine." "I'm not—" She stopped. "You don't have to do that." "I'm aware." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. He had the kind of face that, when still, told you very little about what was happening behind it. She had met men who used that quality to hide things that later turned out to be dangerous. She had also met men who used it simply because they'd been alone long enough to forget the social obligation of performing their thoughts out loud. She could not yet tell which this was. He had set the broth out in 2 bowls, and she had eaten hers without comment. And he had eaten his without comment. And outside, the storm had settled into its night tempo, less violent, more relentless, when she asked the question. She had been sitting with the empty bowl in her hands, staring into it, and he had been doing something at the shelf, resorting small items, which was something he did when he needed to occupy his hands without necessarily occupying his mind. He had almost forgotten she was there, not because she was easy to forget, but because she had the particular quality of stillness that doesn't announce itself. "If the food runs out before the snow melts," she said, "should I dig the grave before or after you tell me to go?" He stopped. The words were quiet. There was no melodrama in them, no performance of pain, no bid for sympathy. They were not a question designed to unsettle him. That was the most disturbing part. They were a real question. She was asking because she had done the practical math of her situation, and she wanted to know the logistics. He turned around slowly. She was still looking at the bowl. Her face was still. "We have enough food," he said. His voice came out carefully. "You said you don't know how long the winter is going to run." "I don't, but I've provisioned for a long one. I do every year." "And if you provisioned wrong?" "Then I'd cut the rations and make it work." "And if making it work wasn't possible?" He looked at her for a long moment. She still wasn't looking at him. She was asking these questions with the calm of someone who has rehearsed for bad outcomes so many times that good outcomes require more effort to imagine than bad ones. "Elara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. He'd gotten it from Duff's papers, the ones he'd had to sign as some form of transaction record that he suspected meant nothing legally and existed only to give the whole thing the costume of legitimacy. I didn't pay 20 gold to let someone freeze. People say things, she said. Not bitterly, just as information. Yeah, he said, they do. She finally looked up at him. You don't know me, she said. I don't know you. You paid money for me in a settlement where that kind of thing happens. I don't know what you want. I don't know what you're expecting. And a pause. The first real pause. The first indication that the controlled surface had something working under it. I have been in situations before where I thought I understood the arrangement, and I was wrong. I'm trying not to be wrong about this one. It was the most she had said since he'd found her. He let it sit in the room for a second before answering. I don't want anything, he said. I saw something that was wrong, and I stopped it. That's all it was. 20 gold is a lot for a moral objection. I had it. Most men who have it don't spend it on strangers. Most men, he agreed. I'm going to ask you one thing, and then I'm going to leave it alone. She waited. Is there somewhere I can take you when the trail clears? Family? Settlement? Someone you trust? She considered it for a moment, and the consideration itself told him more than the answer. No, she said. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, like she was testing the word. He put a new log on the fire. He unfolded the pallet and set it on the floor, close enough to the fire for warmth, far enough from the sleeping platform for some semblance of privacy. He got the blanket from his own shelf, a heavier one, the good one, and put it on the sleeping platform. Get some sleep, he said. Storm won't break before morning. She looked at the sleeping platform, then at him. He had already lowered himself onto the pallet and turned his back to her, which was the most privacy he could offer in a single-room cabin, and he was offering it deliberately. For a long time, she didn't move. He could hear her not moving. He lay still and waited. Eventually, he heard the soft creak of the platform as she settled onto it. He heard her pull the blanket around herself. He heard, after a while, the sound of her breathing change. Still guarded, still not fully the breathing of sleep, but slower, less held. He stared at the ceiling. The fire spoke in small pops and shifts. The storm leaned on the walls. He thought about the look in her eyes when she'd asked about the grave. Not despair exactly. Nothing that dramatic. Something quieter and more wearing than despair. The look of someone who has learned that hope is expensive and they're running a deficit. He thought about what kind of years produce that kind of question. He didn't sleep well. He never slept well in a storm. But eventually, in the early hours, the wind dropped enough that the cabin stopped straining against it, and in that small silence, he went under. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying Black Hollow, burying the trail, burying the distance between wherever Alara Voss had been and wherever she was now, sealing the mountain in white as if the world below had been papered over. The fire burned low. Neither of them dreamed, or if they did, neither remembered it in the morning. The next day came in pale and overcast, with a foot of new snow on the ground, and the sky still carrying the weight of more. Gideon was up before light. He was always up before light. His body had sorted itself to a mountain schedule years ago and had not asked his permission. He restoked the fire, put water on for something hot, and then went out to check on the horse and assess the overnight accumulation. It was cold. Below zero, he guessed. The kind of cold where your breath doesn't so much steam as just disappears, like the air is too cold to bother with it. The horse was fine. He spent 20 minutes with it, cleared the snow from the lean-to roof, checked the water, looked at the sky. They were in for at least another day of this. Maybe two. When he came back inside, Alara was awake. She was sitting on the edge of the sleeping platform with her hair down, working it back into the knot, which she did with the automatic efficiency of someone doing a daily task they've done 10,000 times. She had taken off her coat to sleep but put it back on, and she had her boots, those wrong-sized boots, sitting on the floor in front of her, not yet on her feet. She looked at him when he came in. Snow depth? She asked. Foot, maybe more, still overcast. More coming? Probably. She nodded like this was a budget meeting and she was accepting the figures. I can help with whatever needs doing, she said. I'm not going to sit around. You know how to handle a fire? Yes? Stores are there. He gestured to the shelf. Breakfast is whatever makes sense to you. I'm going to cut more wood before the next wave comes in. She looked at him for a moment like she was expecting a catch. There wasn't one. He picked up his axe from by the door and went back out. From the window, she looked out once. She watched him move to the woodpile behind the cabin, clear the snow from the top of it with 2 sweeps of his arm, and begin splitting. He worked steadily, without the kind of deliberate performance of effort that some men put into physical work when they know they're being watched. He just worked. She turned back to the fire and began to make breakfast. Well, by the second evening, they had developed the first rough version of a routine. Not by discussion, neither of them was particularly inclined toward discussion, but by the natural sorting of 2 people occupying a limited space and trying not to make it worse than it had to be. She cooked. She was better at it than he was, and they both figured this out quickly. He had been cooking for himself for years in the manner of a man who eats because he must, rather than because he particularly wants to, and the results had that quality. She cooked like someone who'd spent time in kitchens under people who were very particular about their cooking, and while she didn't have much to work with, dried meat, flour, the salt, some beans, 2 onions hanging from the roof that he'd grown in a small summer patch and dried himself, she made things taste like something. He didn't say anything about it being good. She didn't ask. He kept the wood supply up and dealt with the outside maintenance. She kept the inside functioning. They ate at the table, 2 chairs, and spoke when there was a reason to speak, which in the first days meant things like, "The flour's running low, where's the rest of it? And your boot's got a hole in it, I can see the cold, and there's mending thread on the lower shelf if you need it." Not warm exchanges, not unfriendly ones. Practical. But on the second night, the storm holding steady, the wind back up to its full complaint, she asked him, while they were eating, how long he'd been on this mountain. 11 years, he said. She looked at the cabin. Doing the math, probably. You built this yourself? Most of it. Second winter, I hired 2 men from a settlement east of here to help with the extension. He indicated the addition on the backside. Rest is mine. Why this mountain? He thought about it for a second. It wasn't a complicated answer, but it was one he hadn't said out loud in a long time. Quiet, he said. And the trapping's good, and I didn't particularly want to be around people. She considered this. And now you've got someone in your cabin. Circumstances change. Do they bother you? She asked. The circumstances. He looked at her. She was asking straight, without either apology or challenge, just asking. Not so far, he said. She went back to eating. A few moments passed. Outside, something in the upper tree line cracked, a branch under too much snow. And they both heard it, but neither reacted, the way people who live with wilderness sounds learn to filter the ones that don't mean anything. I was with a family, she said. Not an announcement, more like she'd been deciding whether to say it and had decided. Before Black Hollow, 6 years. They hired me as household help, and after the first winter started, adjusting the arrangement. He didn't say anything. Not in the way you might be thinking, she said. The man was 70 and unwell, and not that kind of threat. But his son was a different calculation. She stopped. He waited. I left, she said finally, which meant I left without pay and without reference and in the middle of November, which was... She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. A series of decisions I kept being surprised I survived. And Black Hollow was supposed to be a stopover. I had a contact there, someone who'd said they could arrange work in a settlement 2 days north. She picked up her spoon, put it down. The contact didn't materialize. Duff did. He nodded. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me, she said. I don't, he said. Then, I do, but not in the way that's useful to either of us. She looked at him. You're not a situation I need to manage, he said. I'm not telling you to get over it or that you'll be fine. You're a person who had some very bad years and ended up in my cabin during a snowstorm. That's what it is. The look on her face when he said that was something he filed away without looking at too closely. It was the expression of someone hearing a sentence they expected to be conditional and finding out it just ended. Okay, she said. Quiet. Okay, he said. They finished eating. He took the bowls and she wiped the table, and outside the storm kept its counsel, and the fire kept its own, and the cabin held against all of it. She was still afraid of him. Or not afraid exactly, but watchful in the way of something that has been burned enough times to keep a few feet from any fire, regardless of how good it looks. He knew this. He didn't push against it. He figured the mountain would do what needed to be done, because the mountain didn't care about the social niceties of two damaged people finding their way towards something that might turn out to be fine. It just kept snowing, and in the cabin above Black Hollow and below the highest peaks of the Aldrin Range, two people who had chosen solitude for different reasons and by different paths sat on opposite sides of a fire and let the night move around them. And it was not comfortable, and it was not easy, but it was. And this mattered, even if neither of them had the words for it yet. Something that felt faintly, cautiously, like ground that might hold weight. The third morning came in clear and brutal. The storm had broken sometime before dawn, and what it left behind was the particular silence of a mountain after heavy snowfall. A silence so complete it had texture, like wool pressed against the ears. The trees held their white loads without moving. The sky was the hard, pale blue of cold that hasn't decided whether to deepen or break. Gideon was out at first light, which in December at this elevation meant he was out in the dark. He'd heard Alara shift on the sleeping platform when he got up, the small sounds of someone not sleeping pretending to sleep. But she didn't say anything, and he didn't either. He pulled on his layers and went out to assess the damage. 3 feet of accumulation. The lean-to had held. The woodpile tarp had held on one side and collapsed on the other, which meant half the split wood was buried, and he'd spend the first part of the morning digging. He stood in the snow up to his knee and looked at the trail leading down the mountain, or where the trail had been, because it was gone now, smoothed into the same undifferentiated white as everything around it. And he made the calculation he made every year around this time. How long? What the stores would need to carry? Whether the next storm would come before or after this one settled. He had enough. He'd always been careful about that because a trapper who ran out of food on the mountain in February didn't get a second chance to be more careful. But enough was a number that didn't have much slack in it this year, because he'd planned for one person and there were two. He started digging out the woodpile. When he came back in an hour later, Alara was up. She'd made something hot, water with dried herbs from a bundle hanging above the shelf. Something that wasn't quite tea, but was warm and had a smell that cut through the cabin's cold wood and smoke baseline. She handed him a cup without asking, and he took it without comment, and they stood near the fire and drank it, and that was the third morning. By the end of the first week, she had stopped flinching. It was a small thing, and he wasn't sure she was aware of it. But in the first days, whenever he moved quickly, standing up fast from the table, reaching past her for something on the shelf, there was a fractional tightening in her, a microsecond of bracing that she'd gotten good at suppressing but hadn't learned to eliminate. He'd noticed it the second time it happened, and after that he was careful, not obvious about it. He moved with more warning when he could, cleared his throat before approaching from behind, made himself legible in space the way you do around a skittish animal, not because she was one, but because the principle was the same. You don't ask something to trust you and then keep startling it. By the end of the first week, the flinching mostly stopped. He didn't remark on it. What he did remark on, once in passing, was that she'd reorganized the storage shelf. He came in from checking the traps on the east line and noticed immediately, because he'd spent 11 years knowing exactly where everything was on that shelf, and now it was different, not dramatically. She hadn't moved the big items. But the small things, the spice bundles, the wrapped hard cheese, the tools for the cooking, had been regrouped in a way that was, he had to admit, more logical than his system, which had evolved through pure habit rather than any actual organizing principle. He stood in front of the shelf for a moment. "I can put it back," she said from across the room. She was mending something, one of his shirts, the one with the split seam at the shoulder he'd been ignoring for 2 months. She didn't look up. "Why'd you do it this way?" "Things you use every day are at eye level. Things you use less are at the top and bottom. Seemed more useful." He looked at the shelf. She was right. He didn't say she was right, but he started making dinner using the new arrangement, and it was, in fact, more useful. "Fine by me," he said. She made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, the sound before a laugh. The traps were what gave them their first real argument. He'd been running a line of 6 traps on the east slope, checking them every 2 days. Decent results. 3 marten so far, 1 red fox, and the fox pelt was going to be worth something in the spring. He didn't take Alara on the first few trips. The snow was deep, the trail wasn't broken in yet, and he wasn't going to drag someone through that kind of terrain until he knew they could handle it. On the 8th day, she followed him. He didn't realize it until he was halfway to the first trap and heard the footsteps behind him. Or not heard exactly, but felt the slight change in the snow's surface that meant someone was using the trail he'd broken. He stopped and turned. She was about 50 yards back, moving in his tracks because his tracks were the easiest path, wearing his second coat, too big for her, the sleeves folded back twice, and a pair of his heavy wool socks pulled over her own as a second layer inside those terrible too big boots. She had a walking stick she'd made from a branch. She looked, in aggregate, like something assembled from leftover parts. She kept walking toward him. "I didn't say you could come," he said when she reached him. "You didn't say I couldn't. These are my trap lines." "I know." She looked at the trail ahead. "I want to know where they are." He looked at her. The question was obvious. Why? The answer came to him a moment later, and it was not a comfortable answer. She wanted to know where the traps were because she was mapping the territory she was in. Same reason she'd memorized the location of everything in the cabin. Same reason, he suspected, she always sat with her back close to the wall and her face toward the door. She was building a picture of the space so that if the space turned hostile, she would know where to move. He thought about pointing this out, decided against it. "Stay in my tracks," he said. "If you step off the broken trail, you'll go in up to your hip." "I figured," she said. He turned and kept walking. She followed. They checked the traps without much talking. There was a marten in the third one, which he dealt with while she watched, and she didn't look away, which told him something. She asked once how he decided where to set them, and he gave her a real answer about reading animal trails and understanding what prey was looking for in terrain, and she listened in a way that suggested she was actually filing it rather than making conversation. On the walk back, she slipped. Not badly, just off the packed trail into the softer snow beside it, and she went into her thigh before she caught herself on the walking stick. He was ahead of her, and he heard it and turned back. She already had herself out by the time he reached her, using the stick and her own leverage, face tight with effort, and something that might have been embarrassment. "I'm fine," she said, before he said anything. "I can see that," he said. "You don't need to—" "I know I don't." He gave her his arm anyway. Not grabbing, not pulling, just offered it, the elbow out, the way you'd offer it to someone on icy steps. "Another 200 yards on this pitch. Take it or don't." She looked at his arm. She took it. Just for the 200 yards, until the trail leveled. Then she let go, and they walked the rest of the way back to the cabin without incident, and when they got inside and she took off his too large coat and handed it back to him, her hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold, but from the accumulated effort of the whole trip. The legs she wasn't used to using in deep snow, the core strength required. "Your boots are wrong," he said. Not accusatory, just informational. "I'm aware. There's a pair of my old ones in the storage lean-to, smaller. You'd still be swimming in them, but less so." He paused. "I'll get them tomorrow, and I'll wrap the toes with felt so they fit better." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said, the sentence she kept saying in different configurations like a reflex. "I know," he said, and left it there. He got the boots the next morning. He spent the better part of an evening wrapping the toes with felt from an old blanket he'd never gotten around to repurposing, packing them tight enough that when she put them on, they held her foot without too much sliding. It wasn't elegant. The felt made the boots look stuffed, like something a child would make. They were substantially better than what she'd had. She put them on and walked across the cabin and back. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. After that, she came on the trapline every 2 days. The weeks passed. The way weeks pass in deep winter on a mountain. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular texture of days that are full of physical work and very short on light. The sun came up late and went down early, and in between there was always something that needed doing. Wood to cut and stack, water to melt, food to prepare, traps to check, repairs to whatever the last storm had loosened. They divided the labor without much formal discussion, each gravitating toward what they were better at, trading off what required 2 sets of hands. There were good days, and there were harder days. On a good day, they worked alongside each other with a kind of companionable quiet, that had taken time to develop and didn't call attention to itself. On a harder day, something would surface. A mood, a silence that had a different quality than usual, a word that landed wrong. And they would give each other space without making a thing of it, and by the next day it would have settled. He had his own harder days. She probably noticed them, though she didn't say so. There were mornings where he came back from the trap line too quiet, where the weight of years of solitude pushed up against the unfamiliar fact of another person in his space, and he would sit with it and not be especially good company. He had chosen this mountain, this cabin, this particular loneliness, and he had chosen it for reasons that hadn't stopped existing just because the circumstances had changed. Some days those reasons pressed in on him with a force that his better judgment couldn't fully argue against. She never pushed on those days. She let him be where he was and went about her own business, and he found eventually that the heaviness lifted sooner than it would have alone. That surprised him. He had expected the presence of another person to compound the weight. It turned out to do the opposite most days, and he wasn't sure what to do with that information. She talked more as the weeks moved. Not a flood of it. She was still a person who measured her words before she spent them, but more. She told him in increments about her life before the family she'd worked for. She'd grown up in a settlement further south, the daughter of a man who traded in furs, and a mother who died when she was 11. She'd learned to cook from a neighbor woman. She'd learned to read from a missionary schoolroom that had operated for 2 winters before the settlement dissolved. She had a younger brother somewhere. She said it with the careful blankness of someone who has decided not to spend energy on a particular grief, whom she'd lost track of when she was 17 and hadn't found again. He listened. He didn't offer his own history in equivalent installments, because she didn't ask for it, and he found he appreciated that. She seemed to understand that some terrain you don't survey unless you're invited, and she wasn't going to invite herself. What she did, one evening in what he estimated was the 5th week, was pick up one of his books. He was at the table, doing the books, the actual accounts, the ledger he kept of pelts and stores and costs. And she had been sitting by the fire with nothing in her hands, which was a state she didn't seem comfortable in, and she stood and looked at the shelf and pulled one down. He glanced up. She caught the glance. "Can I?" she asked. "They're books," he said. "They don't care." She sat back down. He heard the pages turn. After a while, she laughed, a small, involuntary sound, quickly collected. He looked up. "Which one?" "The trapper who falls in a river," she said. "3rd chapter?" "Yes." "It gets worse," he said. "He falls in again in chapter 6. Different river." She shook her head, still with that almost laugh. "Why does he keep going back to rivers?" "His whole business is rivers is the problem. He can't avoid them." "He could learn to swim." "He tries in chapter 9. It doesn't go well." She read the book over the next 3 days, in the evenings by the fire, and when she finished it, she put it back exactly where it had been on the shelf and selected another one. He noticed she had put the first one back in its place and decided, without dwelling on it, that this was a person who respected the things she borrowed. Then she got sick. It came on fast, the way illness comes when a body has been running on less than it should for a long time, when the reserves that have been keeping everything functional finally hit their limit. One morning she was fine, or fine enough, and by afternoon she was not fine, and by evening it was clear that not fine was an understatement. She was burning. He could tell from across the room the particular sheen of fever sweat, the way she was sitting too still with the effort of managing something internal. She'd been stirring the dinner, and she'd stopped and put the spoon down and sat down on the floor next to the fireplace and put her back against the stone and closed her eyes, and he'd watched this happen from the doorway and understood immediately what he was looking at. "You're running a fever," he said. "I'm all right." "You're not. It's just—" She stopped. The effort of arguing was apparently more than she wanted to spend. Maybe a little. She was not a little. He got her to the sleeping platform, which took more negotiating than it should have because she didn't want to move and kept saying she'd be fine in a minute. The minute came and went. He got her to the platform, got the blankets over her, and stood back and looked at the situation. She was shivering now, which was worse than the stillness. The shivering meant the fever was climbing, the body cranking up the heat, trying to cook out whatever was coming for it. Her face was flushed, and her eyes, when they were open, had the unfocused quality of someone who is present but only partially. She'd pull the blankets up and then kick them off and pull them up again. He had some medical knowledge, the practical kind accumulated through 11 years of being the only person available when things went wrong on this mountain. He'd set his own broken finger twice. He'd stitched a gash in his forearm from a trap accident using a needle and thread and whiskey, neither for the wound. He knew fevers, what they could be and what they couldn't. He looked at the color of her, listened to her breathing, watched the shivering pattern. Not her lungs, he thought. Not that kind of sick. Something in her gut, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of hard living on not enough of everything finally presenting its bill. He built the fire higher. He melted snow continuously and tried to get her to drink. Warm water first, then a broth he made from the stored venison, thin enough to be mostly liquid. She drank what she could and slept and burned and shivered, and he sat on the floor beside the platform with his back against the wall and waited. He slept in increments of less than an hour, waking every time she moved or made a sound. He brought fresh, cool cloths for her forehead when the fever peaked. He'd heard this helped, and it was at minimum something to do with his hands. He kept the fire going. He kept the broth warm. When she woke enough to be somewhat coherent, he made her drink. "You should sleep," she told him, at some point in what he thought was the second night. "I'm fine." "You look terrible. Appreciate that." He handed her the water. "Drink." She drank. She lay back. After a moment, she said, with the particular candor of someone who is too tired to maintain their usual defenses, "Nobody's done this before." He didn't say anything. "Sat up," she clarified. "For me." He turned the cup in his hands. "That's a hard thing to say out loud." "I know." A pause. "I'm saying it anyway." "I hear you," he said. She closed her eyes. The fire moved light across the walls. "It's strange," she said, almost to herself. "It doesn't feel like it costs you anything." He thought about that for a while after she'd gone back to sleep, whether it cost him anything. The sleep it cost him, yes. The firewood, yes. The broth. These were real costs, and he didn't pretend they weren't. But she was asking about something else. Whether this kind of care was coming from some limited supply in him that would run out and leave her with nothing. Whether the bill was accumulating somewhere she couldn't see. He didn't know how to explain that some things were just what you did. That sitting up through a fever wasn't a transaction. That he was not keeping a ledger on her. He wasn't sure she'd believe him if he said it, so he didn't say it. He just sat there, through the second night and into the third day, until the fever broke around mid-morning with the sudden, unmistakable quality of a siege lifting. She woke up soaked through and clear-eyed and exhausted in the clean way of someone who had come through something rather than still being in it. "There you are," he said. She looked at him. He looked like 3 days of no sleep stacked inside a coat. She looked at the fire, still going, the broth on the hook, the cloths folded neatly on the floor beside the platform. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept some." "Gideon, you want broth or not?" She wanted broth. She drank 2 cups of it sitting up in the platform wrapped in the blanket while he sat at the table and drank something hot himself and looked at the middle distance with the specific unfocused expression of someone running on the wrong side of 30 hours without real rest. "Thank you," she said. The words came out differently than they had before. Not managed, not careful, just the actual thing. "Don't," he said. "I'm going to anyway." "Fine." He set down the cup. "I'm going to sleep for about 4 hours. Can you?" "I can manage," she said. "Go." He moved to the pallet, still on the floor where it had been since the first night, and he lay down with his coat still on and was asleep before she had finished the second cup of broth. She sat with the blanket around her and listened to him sleep and looked at the cabin. The shelf, the tools by the door, the books, the window with its frost-edged glass. And something in her chest did a thing she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude, or not only that. Something more complicated. The recognition that the space you're in has been made safer than you expected, and you are not entirely sure what to do with that, and you are not entirely sure you trust it yet, but you can feel the difference between it and everything before it. She sat with that feeling for a while. Then she got up slowly, still weak at the legs, and put another log on the fire, and sat back down and let the winter press its face against the window, and let it. She recovered slowly, the way people recover when they've been running on empty, long enough that their body treats illness like an opportunity to collect on every debt at once. For 3 days after the fever broke, Ilara moved carefully, as if testing the ground beneath each step. She wasn't bedridden, she wouldn't allow that, but she was slower than usual, and Gideon watched, without appearing to watch, the way she'd pause sometimes in the middle of a task and set her hand on the table or the wall, steadying herself against a wave of something. She didn't complain, he didn't comment, he simply moved more of the heavier work onto himself during those days and stacked the wood closer to the door so she didn't have to go out for it, and neither of them acknowledged that he'd done this. By the end of the week, she was back on the trapline with him, boots and all, moving through the packed snow with a steadiness that was part recovered strength and part sheer refusal to be otherwise. February came in hard. The storms were shorter now, but meaner. Fast-moving systems that came off the higher peaks with no warning and hit like something with a grudge. Gideon knew this pattern. Late February on the Aldrin Range was not the beginning of the end of winter. It was winter making its last serious argument. He'd seen men mistake the shorter storms for a loosening and drop their guard, and he'd seen what happened to those men. He didn't drop his guard. He made Ilara learn the same discipline. "If you're on the east line and the sky goes gray from the northwest," he told her one morning, standing at the door, pointing at the ridge above the tree line, "you stop what you're doing, and you come back. Doesn't matter where you are on the line. You leave the trap. You come back. What if there's something in it? Leave it. That's a pelt." "It's a pelt," he agreed. "You're not." She looked at the ridge he'd pointed to. She was learning to read the sky the way he read it, not as background but as information, the way the color shifted, where the clouds built first, what the wind direction meant at different hours of the day. She was a fast learner when the subject had survival attached to it, which he supposed made sense. "Understood," she said. He believed her. That was something new. He'd started believing what she said, not because she'd told him to, but because she'd demonstrated over weeks of small moments that she didn't say things she didn't mean. She was not a person who used words to manage people. She used them to communicate. It was, he had found, a quality he'd forgotten to value until he encountered it again. He was on the West Line when it happened. It was a Tuesday in the second week of February, clear-skied and viciously cold, the kind of cold where the snow doesn't compress properly under your boots, but squeaks instead, a high-pitched complaint with every step. He'd been out since just after dawn, working the far end of the West Line, which pushed up closer to the high terrain than the East Line did. The trapping was better there. The marten population ran denser in the old growth on the western slope, but the terrain was also rougher, less traveled, and he knew it less intimately than the paths he'd been walking for years. He was checking the fifth trap, crouched at the base of a large spruce, when the ground gave way. It didn't announce itself. That was the thing he would keep coming back to in the hours that followed, the complete absence of warning. One moment he was on solid footing, and the next the snow collapsed beneath his left leg, and he dropped, fast and wrong, into a fissure in the rock that the snowpack had been bridging invisibly for weeks. He hit the opposite wall of it going down, his right knee twisting at an angle it was not made for, and then he hit the bottom on his side with a force that drove the air out of him completely and left him lying in the dark of a crack in the mountain, looking up at the ragged hole he'd made in the snow 6 feet above him. He lay there for a moment, just breathing, just taking inventory. The cold was immediate and total. The rock at the bottom of the fissure had no insulation, no snowpack to buffer it, just stone that had been sitting in frozen dark since autumn. His left side, which had taken the impact, was already cataloging its complaints. His right knee was the loudest. He shifted his leg experimentally, and the pain that answered was the kind that said, "This is structural. This is not a bruise. This is something that has moved that should not have moved." He tried to stand, got halfway, and couldn't finish the motion. The walls of the fissure were close enough to touch on both sides, which was useful. He pressed both palms against rock and managed to get himself mostly upright, weight on the left leg, right leg taking nothing, and looked up at the hole above him. 6 feet, straight up, ice-edged and vertical. He looked at it for a while. Then he started working. He had his knife, which was always useful. He had the strap from his pack, which he'd been carrying trapping supplies in. He had about 3 hours of decent light left, maybe less. He did not have a way to climb out of a 6-foot vertical ice fissure on one functional leg without help, and he knew this within the first 10 minutes of trying when the edge crumbled twice under his attempts to find a grip and sent him back to the bottom with ice down his collar and his arms burning. He stopped. He sat against the wall and thought about it. The cabin was 1.5 miles from where he was. Maybe closer to 2 miles, given the route he'd taken on the West Line. Ilara knew the East Line, but she'd only come with him on the West twice, and never to this far end. He had not told her today's specific route. There had been no reason to, because he'd been running this line for years and had never needed anyone to know where he was on it. He looked at his right leg. Even in the dimness of the fissure, he could see the wrong shape of it through his trousers, the way the knee sat slightly off from where it should. He'd seen injuries like this before, on other men. The ones who walked home on them did not do well. He looked up at the hole in the snow. The sky beyond it was still pale blue, still clear. He had probably, he estimated, 4 hours before the cold at this depth finished what the fall had started. He did the only thing left available to him. He packed as much snow as he could reach into the wound on his knee, not for the cold, which was already doing its worst, but to slow the swelling, buy some time for the leg to be somewhat functional, and then he used the knife to chip holes into the ice wall and the strap as a makeshift anchor around the root of the spruce that had been growing at the edge of the fissure and was now, he hoped, anchored well enough to matter. It took him 40 minutes to get out. What that 40 minutes cost him, he would not fully know until the next day. But at the time, it was simply the necessary transaction. He came over the edge of the fissure on his elbows and stomach, dragging his right leg behind him, and lay in the snow above it for a moment with his face against the cold and breathed. Just breathed. Then he started back toward the cabin. He couldn't walk. Walking required a weight transfer. His right leg refused to participate in. What he could do was move, a hitching, ugly stop-start progress through the snow, using a branch he'd pulled from the spruce as a crutch on the right side, his left leg doing the work, the right dragging with a pain he managed by simply not thinking about it directly, the way you don't look straight at something too bright. He left blood in the snow behind him. The knee, or something near it, a cut from the rock face, he thought, though he couldn't feel the specific location through the larger signal of the injury. He didn't look back at the trail he was leaving. He looked forward. The sun was dropping. Ilara had finished the East Line by mid-afternoon and come back to the cabin to find it empty. This was not unusual. He often stayed out longer than her, and she'd come back to an empty cabin before. She stoked the fire, put water on, started working on dinner. An hour passed. She was not worried yet, but she was aware of not being worried in the active way you are when you've decided not to worry and are monitoring whether that decision holds. Another hour. The light outside the window changed to the flat orange of late afternoon, dropping toward dusk. She went to the door and looked out. The trail leading toward the East Line was empty. Of course it was. He was on the west. She looked at the sky. Still clear. No storm coming, at least not immediately. She went back inside. She put on her coat. She told herself she was just going to walk to the tree line and look, which was not entirely a lie and also not the whole truth. What she was doing was following the feeling in her chest that had started about an hour ago, a tightening, a wrongness she had no data for yet, and therefore could not name, only feel. She was at the tree line when she found the beginning of the West Trail. She looked at the snow. Gideon's tracks from this morning were still visible in the packed surface, the characteristic stride of someone who knew where they were going, long and even. She looked further along the trail where it bent west and disappeared into the older growth. She followed it. She told herself she would go a 1/4 mile, then half. Then she stopped telling herself things and just walked, because the light was going, and if something was wrong, a 1/4 mile was not going to tell her anything useful. She found his blood trail 40 minutes into the trees. She stopped when she saw it. The specific color of blood on snow has no equivalent. Not red exactly, something older and darker, a color that comes from inside things. She stood very still for a moment, looking at it. Then she looked at the tracks. The stride had changed completely from the morning tracks she'd been following. Shorter, uneven, the right side lighter, dragging. The tracks of someone moving wrong. She started running. She couldn't run properly in the snow. Nobody could, at this depth, in this terrain. But she moved as fast as the snow would allow, following the trail, following the blood that appeared at intervals in the right side track, following the drag mark of a leg that wasn't bearing weight. Her lungs burned. The cold at this depth of the old growth was worse than near the cabin, the trees holding the freeze close, and she hadn't brought the walking stick, which meant she was pumping both arms for balance on the uneven ground. She heard him before she saw him. Not a call for help. He hadn't called, or if he had, it had been a while ago. What she heard was breathing, the specific, heavy, controlled breathing of someone managing pain through discipline rather than any absence of it. She came around a stand of spruce and nearly ran into him. He had stopped. He was leaning against a tree, a big old larch that was wide enough to be a wall, with his right leg straight in front of him and his left taking all his weight and his face doing the complex work of a man who has been telling himself he's fine for long enough that fine has become purely theoretical. He looked up when she came around the spruce. "Hey," he said. She stopped 4 feet from him, looked at his leg, looked at his face, looked at the ground around him. The blood in the snow, not pouring, but steady, enough to matter. She looked at all of this in about 2 seconds, and then she looked at his eyes. "How bad?" she asked. "Knee's wrong," he said. "I went into a fissure, west line, far end." "Can you walk?" "Not well." "How long have you been out here?" He looked at the sky. 2 hours? Maybe a little more. She did the math. 2 miles back to the cabin, roughly. A man who couldn't walk. Light that had maybe an hour left in it before the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made everything worse. She could not carry him. She weighed probably 60 pounds less than he did, and the terrain between here and the cabin was not the kind you carried someone across. "Put your arm over my shoulder," she said. "I'll be your right side." "Elara." "I'm not asking," she said. "Not sharp, just final." He looked at her for a moment. She was standing in front of him in her coat that was still his old coat, with her hair coming out of its knot from the run through the trees, and she was not asking. He put his arm over her shoulder. The next hour and a half was the hardest physical work of her life, and she had done hard physical work. Supporting a man who outweighed her by a significant margin over 2 miles of mountain terrain in failing light required a constant renegotiation between her balance and his, a continuous adjustment to his stride and the obstacles of the trail. When he stopped to manage the pain, she stopped and held steady without commentary. When the ground sloped and he had to put more weight on her than either of them had planned for, she set her feet and took it. Her shoulder would be bruised for a week from the pressure of his arm. She didn't notice it then. He tried, twice, to tell her to leave him and go get something, anything, a travois maybe, come back for him. "We'd lose the light," she said both times, and kept moving. He stopped arguing. They didn't talk much on the way back. There wasn't air for it. They were both working too hard. What passed between them was functional. Step here, not there. Watch the route. Stop for a second. Okay, go. The kind of language that isn't really language, but keeps two people moving through a problem together. The last quarter mile, with the cabin visible through the trees and the sky going fully dark, she started to feel it. The accumulated weight of the hour and a half dragging through her legs, her shoulder, her lower back. She was shaking slightly from effort rather than cold, and she was aware of how close the edge was, but she did not stop and she did not slow down. And when they finally came through the tree line and across the open ground to the cabin door, she didn't feel relief so much as the simple mechanical fact of arrival. She got him inside, got him to the chair by the fire, went back and shut the door. Then she stood in the middle of the cabin and breathed for a minute. Just that. "There's whiskey," he said. "Top shelf, behind the flower." "I know where it is," she said. She got it down. She handed it to him for the knee, then went and added wood to the fire and got the lamp lit, because she was going to need to see what she was dealing with. What she was dealing with was not good. The knee had swollen in the cold, which was the cold being useful for once, compressing the swelling somewhat. But now inside the cabin it was going to do the opposite. She cut his trouser leg carefully with his knife, exposing the joint, and looked at it under the lamp. She had seen injuries before. She had set a dislocated shoulder once on a man at the family's property who'd fallen from a roof, had done it under instruction from a more experienced woman with steady hands and a high tolerance for people yelling at her. She knew what dislocation looked like, broadly. She knew what this looked like. The kneecap had moved. Not far, but enough. And there was the cut from the rock, 2 inches below the knee on the inside of the leg. Not deep enough to be life-threatening on its own, but open and dirty with grit and debris from the fissure. "This needs to go back," she said, meaning the kneecap. "I know," he said. "I've done a shoulder, not a knee. Principle's the same." She looked at him. "You know how?" "I know what it's supposed to feel like when it goes. You'll know when it's right." A pause. "More whiskey first." "You don't want to be too far under." "I know what I want." She gave him more whiskey. She cleaned the cut with a cloth and what was left of the whiskey, which caused language she chose not to repeat, and she stitched it. 4 stitches, uneven, but closed, with the mending thread from the lower shelf because it was what she had and it would hold. And he sat through that with his jaw set and his eyes on the ceiling, and she worked as fast as she could without being careless. Then she put her hands on the kneecap. "Tell me when you're ready," she said. He took a breath. "Go." She pressed and rotated, working from the description he'd given her and from the instinct of having handled one joint emergency before and knowing that the body has a place it wants to be and your job is to find it. He made a sound that came from somewhere behind his teeth, and she felt the moment. A give, a shift, the joint finding its way back to where it belonged, and she held pressure for a count of 5 and then let go carefully, her hands shaking. "Did it move?" she asked. He exhaled, long, complete. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it moved." She sat back on her heels. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was rough but present. "I should be asking you that." "You're shaking." "I'm aware." She pressed harder. "Give me a minute." He gave her a minute. She sat on the floor beside the chair and breathed, and the fire was going now and the lamp was warm, and outside the full dark of a mountain February night had settled on everything, and they were inside and the door was shut and the work was done. "You found the blood trail," he said after a while. "Yes." "How far out were you when you found it?" "About halfway to you." He was quiet for a moment. "You ran." "I moved fast," she said, which was her version of yes. "Elara." He waited until she looked up at him. His face looked like someone who has been through a significant amount of physical punishment and has arrived at a particular kind of clarity that only comes at that cost. I wouldn't have made it back." "You might have." "No," he said, flat, certain. "I wouldn't have." She held his gaze. "Then it's a good thing I found the trail," she said. He nodded, just once. But it was the kind of nod that means more than agreement. It means, "I understand what you did, and I am not going to insult it by making it smaller than it was." She got up and made food, because bodies that have been through what their bodies had been through needed to eat. She made it with what was near at hand, dried venison, broth, the last of the dried onion, and she helped him eat it without making a production of the helping, and he ate without making a production of the kneading it. She packed the knee with snow wrapped in cloth to keep the swelling manageable through the night. She folded a blanket under it for elevation. She found a length of wood that could serve as a rough splint and bound it in place with strips from the cloth she'd used for the compresses, tying it firm but not tight, the way she'd seen it done once and had apparently retained in the part of her memory reserved for information that might matter someday. "Is that too tight?" she asked. He tested it. "No, it's good. Try to keep it elevated." "I know. I'll check it in the middle of the night." "You don't have to." "I know I don't," she said. The words he'd said to her over and over in all the weeks before this. She said them back to him without emphasis, without making a point of it, and went to the sleeping platform and lay down in her coat and closed her eyes. He looked at the fire for a long time. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his leg, elevated on the folded blanket, the improvised splint holding it in an approximation of the right position. He thought about the fissure and the 40 minutes it had taken to get out of it, and the 2 miles that had come after. He thought about her face when she'd come around the spruce and found him. Not the fear. She'd folded the fear up and put it somewhere quickly, the way she'd learned to do with things that couldn't be useful in the moment. What he'd seen, just for a second before the folding, was something he recognized without a word for it. The look of someone who has found what they were looking for and is not going to examine too closely why the finding mattered so much. He understood that look. He'd felt a version of it himself, an hour and a half later, when the cabin door closed behind them, and the cold was outside, and she was inside, and they were both still here. He didn't sleep well. The pain kept him at the surface, but Alara was up twice in the night. He heard her, though he kept his eyes closed, checking the splint, refreshing the snow compress, rebuilding the fire when it dropped too low, moving quietly through the cabin in the dark, doing what needed doing, asking nothing about it. In the gray early hours before dawn, lying still and listening to the mountains settle around the cabin, Gideon Mercer thought about what it meant to be saved by someone you'd thought you were saving. He didn't arrive at a clean answer. The mountain didn't traffic in those, but the question sat in his chest in a way that was not uncomfortable. More like the feeling of a room you've been in a long time suddenly having a window opened in it, and the air coming through is cold and sharp and real. And you didn't know until right then how much you'd needed it. Outside, the dark held on a little longer, and then started to give, the way it always did, the way it always would. The cabin stood against the last of the night, smoke rising from the chimney in the still air, 2 sets of tracks in the snow leading to the door and stopping there. Both sets going in, neither one going out. The first week after the injury was the hardest thing Gideon had endured in 11 years on that mountain, and the injury itself was only part of it. The knee, once back in its proper position, needed time. Not a little time, real time, the kind measured in weeks rather than days. He had known this going in. He had known it and had not fully reckoned with what it meant for a man who had organized his entire existence around physical self-sufficiency to suddenly require assistance for things as basic as getting from the sleeping platform to the chair. His body was the instrument of his life here. It always had been. And now the instrument was compromised, and there was nothing to do about it but sit with that fact and try not to let the sitting drive him sideways. Alara checked the knee every morning. She did it the same way she did most things, without theater, without asking his permission or his feelings about it. She would crouch beside the platform, unwrap the cloth binding, look at the swelling with those creek-water eyes that gave nothing away, press gently at the places that mattered, and then wrap it again. She had settled into this routine by the 3rd morning as if she'd been doing it for years. "Still swollen," she said, on the 4th morning. "I can see that," he said, "less than yesterday." "I can see that too." She looked up at him. "You're in a mood." "I'm not in a mood." "You've answered everything I've said in 2 words or less since yesterday afternoon." He looked at the ceiling. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're stuck inside and it's making you difficult." She finished the rewrapping, tied it off, sat back. "Which is understandable. I'm not complaining. I'm just naming it." He was quiet for a moment. "The east line hasn't been checked in 4 days." "I checked it yesterday." He looked at her. "You went out alone? You were asleep. I know the east line better than I know my own hands at this point." She stood. 2 Martin, 1 empty, 1 sprung with nothing in it. I reset the sprung one. Pelts are hanging in the lean-to. He stared at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But it wasn't nothing. It was the particular feeling of being looked after by someone you had been looking after. And it sat in him strangely. Not badly, just strangely, like a word you've known for years that you suddenly hear in someone else's voice and realize you've been mispronouncing. The trapline became hers through practical necessity and then through something more than that. She ran both lines, east and west, though she went no further on the west than the point where the terrain dropped toward the old growth at the far end, because Gideon had told her to stay off that terrain alone, and she agreed with the logic even if she didn't say so. She checked the traps, dealt with what was in them with a competence that had grown through repetition, and brought the pelts back to the cabin where she learned, through his instruction from the chair, to skin and stretch and hang them properly. That first instruction session was rough. He told her what to do, step by step, and she did it, and when she did it wrong, he told her so. And when he told her so, the 3rd time in 10 minutes, she set down the knife and looked at him. "I understand that you know more about this than I do," she said. Even. Controlled. "I'm going to ask you to tell me what I'm doing wrong without the tone that suggests I'm doing it wrong on purpose." A silence. "Fair," he said. "Thank you. You're cutting toward yourself. Blade should be going away, so if it slips, you don't open your hand." She adjusted her grip. Like this? Yes, better. They managed the rest of the session without significant friction. He was not, he admitted to himself later, a natural teacher. He had spent 11 years being the only student in his own education, and the habit of knowing things without having to explain them had calcified into something that came across apparently as impatience. She had called him on it directly and without drama, and he had appreciated that even while sitting with the brief discomfort of being called on something. She learned fast. Within 2 weeks, she was skinning cleanly and stretching with a consistency that showed she'd understood not just the steps, but the reasoning behind them. He watched from the chair, offering corrections less and less often. By the end of the second week, he was mostly watching. "You don't have to supervise," she said one evening, not looking up from the pelt she was working. "I'm not supervising. I'm sitting. You're sitting and watching me very carefully. That's what you do when you can't do things yourself." She looked up then. He said it without self-pity, just as information, the flat, undecorated fact of someone who has accepted a temporary condition without liking it. She held his gaze for a moment. "You're not as useless as you think you are," she said. "I can't work the lines. I can't cut wood. I can barely—" "You fixed the snare last week," she said. "The one with the bent trigger I brought back. You had it done in 20 minutes. That's sitting down work." "It's still work." She went back to the pelt. "You've been telling me what I'm doing wrong with the stretching frames, and because of that, the hides are coming out better. That's work. You looked at the weather last Tuesday and told me not to go out, and you were right about the storm, so I didn't lose a day in a whiteout. That's work." He said nothing. "I know what it feels like," she said, "to be in a place and feel like you're consuming more than you're contributing." She said it without looking up. Her hands kept moving on the pelt. "I spent the better part of 6 years feeling exactly like that. I'm telling you that's not what's happening here." The fire settled. Outside, the wind ran along the roof and dropped away. "I hear you," he said. The words he'd said to her months ago when she told him something true in the dark. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face acknowledged the echo. The wood was the real problem. He had a significant supply stacked, but significant was a relative term in late February on a mountain, when the temperature didn't climb above zero even at midday and the fire needed feeding around the clock. He'd been cutting and stacking since October. It was the work of autumn, the work that kept you alive in February. But his calculation had been for one person. They were burning through the stack faster than he'd projected, and he knew it, and he watched the stack diminish with the particular anxiety of a man who understands exactly what wood means on a mountain in winter. He told her on a Sunday morning, early, before the light had fully decided on itself. "We need to talk about the wood," he said. She looked at the stack through the window. She'd already looked at it, he could tell. "How long do we have at this burn rate? 3 weeks? Maybe 4? And the weather? Could break in 3, could hold for 6. She absorbed this. "There's standing deadwood on the east slope," she said. "I've seen it on the line. You know how to use the axe?" "I've used an axe." He looked at her. "Not like a courtesy axe in a kitchen garden. These are full trunks." "Show me what I'm doing wrong before I start," she said, "and I'll learn faster." He had her bring the axe inside. He talked her through it from the chair. Grip, stance, the angle of the strike, where to stand relative to the wood, what to do when the blade sticks. She listened, the way she always listened to things that mattered, filing it with the same careful attention she'd applied to everything from the trap line to the shelf organization to reading the northwest sky for weather. The next morning, she went out to the east slope with the axe and the small sled he used to haul wood back to the cabin. She was gone for 3 hours. When she came back, the sled had 4 sections of deadwood on it. Not huge, but solid. And she was breathing hard and had bark dust in her hair, and a blister forming on the inside of her right palm where the axe handle had worked against her grip. "Show me the hand," he said when she came in. She held it out. He looked at it. "Wrap it before you go back out. The cloth strips in the tin on the middle shelf. I know where they are. I know you know." She wrapped her hand and went back out. She came back with more wood. She went out again in the afternoon. By the time the light failed, she had brought back enough deadwood to meaningfully extend what they had, and she stacked it beside the existing pile with the same logic she'd applied to the cabin shelf. The heaviest pieces at the bottom, the splittable sections closest to the door. That night her hands were shaking at dinner. Not from cold. from the sustained grip of an axe held for 6 hours by hands that hadn't held an axe for 6 hours before. She managed the spoon without comment, and he said nothing about the shaking, and they ate in the particular comfortable quiet that had become the texture of their evenings together. After dinner, she sat by the fire with her wrapped hand on her knee, not reading, just looking at the fire. He was at the table, doing the ledger. The accounting he could do sitting down, the work of numbers rather than muscle. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "Why here?" She gestured vaguely at the cabin, the mountain, all of it. "You told me before, the trapping, the quiet. You didn't want to be around people, but that's the what. I'm asking the why." He put the pencil down, looked at the ledger for a moment. "There was a town," he said, "further south. I had a life there, a house, a business. I was trading, furs and goods, nothing complicated. A woman I was going to marry." She waited. "She died," he said. "Fever, fast, the kind that gives you 3 days between fine and not fine, and then it's done." He was quiet. "After that, the town felt like a room with all the furniture moved. I kept reaching for things that weren't where I'd left them." "So you left?" "So I left." He picked up the pencil, put it down again. "The mountain was supposed to be a year, maybe 2. Get level again, come back." "That was 11 years ago," she said. "Yeah." "Did you get level?" He considered it honestly. "I got functional," he said, "which is not the same thing, but it was enough most days." She nodded. Not with pity. He would have disliked pity, but with the recognition of someone who understood the gap between functional and level, who had lived in that gap themselves for a long time. "What was her name?" Elara asked. "Catherine," he said. The name came out without the pain he expected, just the name, like a stone placed carefully on a surface. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't always make it shorter," she said. He looked at her. She was right, and she'd said it without trying to be wise about it. Just said it because it was true, and she knew it from her own inventory of things that were long ago and still present. "No," he said, "it doesn't." The fire moved between them and they let it, and the ledger sat unfinished on the table and neither of them cared about it. March arrived. March on the Aldrin Range was not spring. It was winter with a different attitude, still brutal, still capable of killing you, but doing it with less conviction than February, like an argument that's starting to run out of material. The storms were shorter, the light held a little longer each day. The cold still hit below 0 at night, but would sometimes, briefly, in the middle of the afternoon when the sun found the south-facing slope above the cabin, climb almost to bearable. Gideon's knee was improving. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks. Twice in February he'd moved wrong in the night and woken to a swelling that set him back several days. But the trend was in the right direction. By the first week of March, he could put weight on it with a cane made from a branch Elara had selected from the woodpile for having the right diameter and a naturally useful bend at the top. He had not asked her to make it. He came back from the outhouse one morning to find it leaning against the door. "What's this?" he'd said. "It's a cane," she said. "I can see that. Your left leg's been compensating for 7 weeks and it's going to give you trouble eventually. Distribute the load." He used the cane. His left leg did not give him trouble. With the cane, he could participate more. Not the trap line. Not yet. And she'd taken that over completely anyway, running both lines with a confidence that no longer needed his commentary. But inside the cabin and around it, he could do more of the standing work, the slow work. He rebuilt the broken stretching frame that she'd been managing around. He sharpened every blade in the cabin, the knives, the hand axe, the skinning blades, which was sitting work with occasional standing, and he could manage it. One afternoon she came back from the east line and set her pack down and stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the wall where the pelts were stacked and counted something in her head. 23 marten, she said. 6 fox, 2 ermine. Good count, he said. What are they worth, in Black Hollow or wherever you sell? He told her. She did the math in her head faster than he expected. He'd forgotten that she could read and therefore probably could also calculate. That's a real season, she said. It is. Better than last year? He looked at the stack. Better than last year, he said, which was true, and had something to do with two people running two lines consistently rather than one person running one, though he didn't say that directly. She looked at the pelts for another moment. There was something in her face he couldn't fully read. A particular private expression, like she was turning a thought over that she wasn't ready to put into words yet. Then she shrugged off her coat and went to start the fire for dinner. The argument happened on a Tuesday, the second week of March, over the water situation. The creek below the cabin, which was his main summer water source, was still frozen. He'd been melting snow all winter, but the snow on the north side of the cabin was getting picked over. He'd been drawing from the same area long enough that he was starting to bring in snow that had surface debris in it, bark and pine needle, and the particular gray of old settled snowpack. The quality wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't ideal. He wanted to start sourcing from further up the slope, where the snowpack was cleaner and deeper. He told her, while she was getting the morning water, that he'd go up the slope and bring some back. She turned around. "You'll go up the slope. The snow's clean up there, and on that knee. The knee is better. The knee is better enough to move around the cabin," she said. "Not better enough to climb a slope with a full load. I've been on the cane for 2 weeks. I'll go," she said. "It's a half-mile up and back with a full pack, Alara. I'm not sending you up a mountain slope alone to haul water so you can rest a joint that still swells if you stand on it too long." She wasn't backing down. She was doing the thing she did when she'd made a decision and it was finished, standing still and looking at him directly. Not confrontationally, but not moving either. "I'll go. You'll stay. You'll check the stretching frames. That's the plan." "You're not in charge of the plan. Today I am." She picked up the pack. "I know what I'm doing. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He stopped. Because she was right. That wasn't the point. The point was that it felt wrong to sit in a chair while she climbed a slope to haul water. The point was something about how he understood his own function in this arrangement, and how that function had been entirely redistributed over the past 6 weeks. And some days he could manage that redistribution, and some days it sat in his chest like a stone. And this was one of the stone days. "It bothers you," she said. Her voice changed, still direct, but quieter. "Letting someone else carry things. I've been carrying things myself for a long time." "I know you have." She set the pack down, not giving up, just setting it down. "Gideon, I'm not doing this because you're helpless. You're not helpless. I'm doing it because you have an injury and I don't, and therefore I'm the one who should be climbing the slope. That's all it is." He looked at her. "It doesn't mean you owe me something," she said. "It doesn't mean the ledger is off. It just means that this week, I'm the one who can do this particular thing, so I'll do it." A pause. "Next week, when your knee is better, you'll do something I can't. That's how this works." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire was going. The cabin smelled like the morning, wood smoke and cold air, and the dried herbs she'd started using again when cooking once she'd gotten through the first batch. "Take the shorter route," he said. "Up the south side, not the west. The south-facing slope will be more compacted." "I know," she said, "and don't fill the pack all the way. 2/3. You don't need to do it in one trip. I'll do 2 trips if I need to. 2 trips is fine." She picked the pack back up. "Check the frames," she said. "I'll check the frames," he said. She went out. He checked the frames. 3 of them needed tightening. The cold had shrunk the lashing, and he did it standing at the wall, taking his time, moving carefully, the cane leaning against the shelf beside him. When he finished, he sat down and looked at the work, and it was good work, small and necessary and done. She came back an hour later with clean snow. She went out again after lunch and came back with more. That evening, they had the cleanest meltwater they'd had in weeks, and she made a thin soup with it that tasted like something rather than nothing, and they ate it at the table. "Good water," he said. "Told you," she said. "I didn't say you were wrong about the water. I said—" He stopped. "You said you didn't want me going up alone," she said. "I went alone, and I'm here, so—" "So," he agreed. She poured more soup. He watched her do it and thought about what she'd said. That's how this works. And the casualness of it, the way she'd said it like it was obvious, like the idea of 2 people simply covering each other's limitations was the most straightforward thing in the world and had not, for most of his adult life, been a concept he'd been able to make practical sense of. He'd had a version of it once, with Catherine. He remembered it now. The specific ease of a life arranged around two people compensating for each other's missing pieces, so naturally that you stopped noticing it was happening. He'd spent 11 years missing that ease without being able to name what it was he missed. He could name it now. The third week of March, he made it to the East Line. Not alone, she went with him, which he accepted without arguing this time because he wasn't stupid. And the cane on a packed snow trail was manageable, but the packed snow trail becoming unpacked snow trail was a different proposition, and if something went wrong, he didn't want to repeat the architecture of February. They went together. He moved slower than he used to. She adjusted her pace without mentioning it. The East Line had 3 marten and a fox. She dealt with the marten while he dealt with the fox, and it was the first time in 6 weeks they'd worked a trap together, side by side, and it felt like the return of something he hadn't known he was waiting for. On the way back, on a flat stretch where the walking was easier, she said, "The creek will break in a few weeks." "Probably." "And the lower trail?" "Another month, maybe. Depends on the snowmelt." She nodded. She was looking at the trail ahead, at the cabin visible now through the last stand of spruce before the open ground. He looked at the same thing and tried to see it from her angle. The cabin, the lean-to, the woodpile she'd built back up, the trap line she'd kept running, the whole small working world of it. He wondered what she saw when she looked at it, whether it looked like a place she'd been held or a place she'd been part of. He couldn't ask her that, not yet, but he thought about it, walking back on a bad knee with a cane and a season's worth of good pelts waiting in the lean-to. The kind of season that came from 2 people working something instead of 1. And he thought about it again that evening when she was reading by the fire with her feet pulled up under her, like she'd been sitting in that particular chair in that particular position her whole life. And the question lived in him without answer, and he let it. Outside, the mountain was doing something it only did at the very edge of winter. Not warming, not yet, but shifting. Some quality of the air changed at the end of March. Some pressure or smell, or the way sound carried differently when the snowpack started its first molecular loosening. You couldn't call it spring, but you could call it almost if you were careful about it. Gideon sat across from Alara in the cabin his hands had built, and the fire she had kept going and thought about, almost. It was not a comfortable thought, and it was not an uncomfortable one. It was just a thought that sat in the middle of his chest and occupied space, and he breathed around it, and it stayed. You said, Part 5, Louis. Viết 3.5 chăm tư liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, và hối thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5, Louis. Viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không Việt lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hồi thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sảng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. 13 Chartres 16. Claude responded, Part 5. The choice that changed everything. Part 5. The choice that changed everything. The creek broke on a Wednesday. Alara heard it first, a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath for months, the ice cracking in long, slow progressions down the stream bed below the cabin. She was outside splitting kindling when it happened, and she stopped with the axe mid-swing and just listened. Gideon came to the door a moment later, having heard it from inside, and they both stood there in the thin April morning and listened to the mountain begin its slow negotiation with the season. It was not a dramatic thaw. It never was, this high up. The snow didn't vanish, it retreated, inch by inch, from the south-facing slopes first, exposing the dead grass beneath it in irregular patches that spread and merged over days. The creek ran muddy and fast with snowmelt. The spruce trees shed their white loads in sudden soft avalanches when the temperature crept above freezing in the afternoons. The sky changed color, from the hard winter blue to something softer, with actual clouds in it again, rather than just the flat gray of storm systems. Gideon walked without the cane most days now. He still favored the right leg on slopes and in the mornings, when the joint had stiffened overnight. But the cane had migrated from constant companion to occasional backup, leaning against the wall near the door for the days when the weather changed fast, and his knee registered the barometric pressure before the sky did. He'd started running the west line again, though not the far end, that he left alone, by unspoken agreement with himself, until he trusted the leg completely. They worked the lines together most days, not because either of them needed the company on the trail, both were capable of managing it alone, but because they had fallen into the habit of it during his recovery, and the habit had outlasted the necessity, and neither of them had suggested changing it. The lower trail opened on a Thursday in the second week of April. Gideon knew it before he checked it, the same way he knew most things about this mountain. Through the accumulated knowledge of 11 springs, the way the drainage patterns worked on the south-facing grade, the temperature sequence that meant the trail-breaking frost was done and the mud beneath would hold a horse's weight. He went and confirmed it that morning. The trail was open, rough and wet and demanding, not the kind of thing you'd want to travel in a hurry, but passable. He came back to the cabin and said so. Alara was at the table. She'd been going through the pelt inventory. They'd started the slow work of bundling and cataloging the season's take in preparation for selling, and she had a piece of paper in front of her with a list of numbers. She looked up when he came in. "Trail's open," he said. "I heard you go check." He hung his coat. "We could make Black Hollow in a day and a half. 2 days if the mud's bad on the lower grade." She looked at the paper. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Pelts are ready," she said. "I finished the last bundle yesterday." "I know." Silence. The fire was going low and neither of them moved to fix it. "I'll start packing the horse load tomorrow," he said. Which was the practical next step. Which was the thing you said when the trail was open and the season's work was done, and there was a settlement at the bottom of the mountain with buyers for your pelts, and a world that existed outside of this cabin and these lines and this particular circle of fire and snow. "Okay," she said. She went back to the paper. He went and put a log on the fire. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, looking at the flames catch on the new wood. He had been turning something over in his mind for 3 weeks, since the creek ice had started to thin and the math of the season's end had become inevitable. And he had not said it out loud because saying it out loud required a kind of courage that was different from the courage of falling into fissures or stitching yourself shut, the kind that has no adrenaline to carry it. He turned around. "Where will you go?" he asked. She looked up from the paper. Something moved across her face, quick, controlled. "I haven't decided. North Settlement is 2 days past Black Hollow. I know someone there who runs a trading post. He's a decent man. I could write you a letter." "You'd write me a letter," she said. Flat. He couldn't tell what was behind it. "If you wanted." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the paper down and reached into the inside pocket of her coat. The coat that was her own now, the one she'd re-sewn and rebuttoned over the winter until it fit. And she put something on the table. A coin. Gold. 1 coin. He looked at it, then at her. "I took it the day you paid for me," she said, "from Duff's table, when he cut the rope and you went back to the horse." She said it level. No apology in it, but no defiance either, just the fact of it. "I could pick a lock before I was 15. Duff's coin pouch wasn't complicated." He looked at the coin on the table. "I've been carrying it since November," she said. He understood in the space of the next few seconds what she was actually telling him. Not just that she had the coin, that she had always had it. That from the first days, Through the fever, through the storm, through the trap lines and the wood hauling and his injury and all of it, she had held in her hand the price of her own exit. "You could have left," he said. "Yes. Any time. Any time the trail allowed," she said, which was not often, but enough times. There were days in February, before your fall, when I thought about it. "What stopped you?" She looked at the coin. "Different things, different days." A pause. "At first it was practical. I had nowhere to go and the mountain was safer than the alternatives. Then it was, you were sick, or I was sick, and leaving felt wrong. Then the fall happened." She stopped. Started again, more carefully. "And then I stopped thinking about leaving and started thinking about something else, and I didn't know what to do with that." He waited. "I want to give it back," she said. "The coin. You paid it for me and I stole it and I'm giving it back." She pushed it across the table toward him. "My debt to you is settled. Whatever you think you're owed, it's paid. I carried you 2 miles on a bad knee in the dark through wolf territory. I ran your trap lines for 6 weeks. I stitched your leg and reset your joint and made sure you didn't freeze while you slept." Her voice was steady, but it was doing work to stay that way. "We're even. I don't owe you anything, and you don't owe me anything. Whatever comes next comes from a clean start." He looked at the coin on the table between them. Then he looked at her. "Is that what you wanted to say?" he asked. "Most of it. What's the rest?" She was quiet for long enough that the new log on the fire caught fully and the light in the room shifted. "I'm a free woman," she said, "as of right now. No debt, no obligation, no one holding anything over me." She met his eyes. "I've been a lot of things in my life, and I have not been that. Not since I was 11 years old and my mother died. So I need you to understand that what I say next is coming from someone who is free to say it or not say it." He said nothing. He was very still. "Do you want me here?" she asked. "When the next winter comes, not as a debt, not as an arrangement, not because it's practical or because the trail is closed and there's nowhere else to go." She stopped. "Do you actually want me here?" The fire said something. Outside, the creek ran over its newly freed stones, talking to itself the way mountain water does when it's been quiet all winter and suddenly has room. Gideon looked at this woman across the table from him. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been looking at for months without letting yourself see it straight, the way you finally turn your eyes to the thing you've been watching from the side. He saw the coat she'd rebuilt from the disaster it had been. He saw the calluses on her hands that hadn't been there in November, from the axe and the trapline and the work of keeping something alive through the worst season. He saw the scar on the inside of her right palm from the first week of woodcutting, when the axe handle had raised a blister that had broken and healed wrong and left a mark she didn't mention and he didn't ask about. He saw the level way she was looking at him now, asking him something real and being honest about the cost of asking it. He picked up the coin. He held it for a moment. It was cold from sitting on the table, the particular cold of gold, denser than you expect, heavier than it looks. He turned it over once in his fingers, then he set it back down. Not toward her, not away from her, just in the middle of the table. "I don't want to be alone next winter," he said. It came out without the armor he might have put around it if he'd planned it, which was probably the only way it could have come out honestly. "I've been alone on this mountain for 11 years, and I was okay with that. And then you were here, and I was still okay. I was better than okay, which surprised me because I'd convinced myself that I'd chosen alone for good reasons that hadn't changed." He paused, looked at the coin. "Those reasons haven't changed. The mountain didn't change. But the math on whether alone is what I want, that changed." She was watching him. "I want you here," he said, "not because you're useful, and not because I feel like I owe you something, and not because the winter is coming. Because you are specifically you and the cabin is different with you in it, and I don't want to go back to the version without you." Something shifted in her face. Not breaking, nothing as dramatic as that. More like a door that had been latched for a long time, moving, just slightly, on its hinges. The particular movement of a person who has been holding something closed and is deciding, consciously, to let it sit open for a minute and see what the air feels like. "That's the most words you've said at once," she said, "since I've known you." "I'm aware." "Was that hard?" "Yes," he said. without hesitation. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Good, she said. It should be. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be comforting. It's supposed to be true. She picked up the coin. She turned it over the same way he had, feeling the weight of it. I've been carrying this for 5 months. Every time I thought about leaving, I'd take it out and hold it and think about where I'd go and what I'd do and whether any of it made more sense than staying. A pause. It never made more sense than staying. Eventually, I stopped taking it out. But you kept it. I needed to know it was there. I needed to know the door was unlocked. She looked at him. I've been in too many locked rooms. I know, he said. I need you to know that about me. If I'm going to be here, really here, not just stuck here, I need the door to always be unlocked. If I decide to leave, I leave. No account to settle, no permission to ask. That was always true, he said. I know. I'm saying it out loud so we both hear it. Okay, he said. I hear it. She set the coin down between them again, looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and walked to the shelf and put it on the top row, between the 2 books that leaned against each other on the left end, the one about the trapper who kept falling into rivers, and a thinner volume he'd never mentioned the title of. She put the coin there like she was marking a place. So I'll stay, she said. Not a question, not an announcement, just the plain fact of a decision made by someone who is capable of making it freely. So you'll stay, he said. She came back to the table and picked up the inventory list and looked at it. The marten pelts should go first. Best quality, and the buyers will compete for them. Don't let whoever's at Duff's set the price. Make them bid against each other if there are more than 2. I know how to sell pelts. I know you do. I'm just saying. You're always just saying. And you're usually better off for it, she said. He didn't argue with that because it was true. They packed the horse the next morning in the pale early light, the mountain fog sitting in the lower trees the way it did in the shoulder seasons, the world smelling like mud and pine and the particular green smell of things about to grow. It took 2 hours. The pelts were heavy. The supplies for the return trip needed to be balanced against the sale goods, and Gideon's system for loading was particular, and Alara had learned it, and they worked through it together without significant disagreement, except on the question of where to put the fox bundles, which they eventually resolved by Alara being right. Before they left, she stopped on the porch. He came out and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The mountain, the slope, the tree line running up toward the peaks that were still white when everything below them was beginning to turn. The cabin behind them, the smoke from the banked fire rising straight up in the still morning air. The creek audible now below the tree line, running clear and fast over rocks that had been buried since November. It was not a beautiful morning in the polished sense. The fog was thick, and the mud on the trail ahead was going to be miserable, and the horse was already expressing opinions about the load balance. The peaks were hidden. The light was flat and gray and functional rather than golden or dramatic. But she stood there and looked at it like she was memorizing it, like she was taking a picture of something she intended to keep. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Just looking. He looked at the same view. He'd looked at it 1,000 times from this porch, had stood here in every season and every weather, had watched the light change across it through 11 years of mornings, and it had been a long time since he'd looked at it rather than just faced it. He looked at it now. The mountain was not kind. It had never been kind. It had no particular interest in their survival, had nearly taken both of them in different ways across one winter, would make no accommodation for the bad days or the injured days, or the days when everything felt too heavy to carry. It would bring its worst without warning, and it would offer its best sparingly, and it would ask every single day whether you were willing to keep paying the cost of staying. He had paid that cost alone for 11 years. It had been enough. It had kept him alive and functional and adequately removed from the world that had hurt him. It had not been enough in any of the ways that turned out to matter. We should go, he said. We should go, she agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. The creek ran. The fog sat in the trees. The horse made its feelings known. Then they went. Down the trail, into the mud and the thaw, and the long way toward Black Hollow, side by side where the trail was wide enough, and single file where it wasn't. Not holding hands, that would come later maybe, in its own time, without being forced toward it. not with speeches or declarations or the architecture of a beginning that announces itself. Just two people on a mountain trail in April, heading toward a world they'd both been damaged by, carrying a season's work between them. Neither one pretending the hard parts were done, and neither one pretending that hard parts were sufficient reason to stop. What had started in mud and cold and a transaction that had no dignity in it had become something that couldn't be purchased or sold and couldn't be burned out by fever or broken by falls or buried under any depth of snow the mountain could manage. It had no clean name. It didn't need one. The kind of thing built out of the worst conditions two people can share tends to hold better than the kind built in comfort, because it has already been tested and has already held, and both people know it. The trail bent south. The mountain rose behind them, indifferent and enormous, keeping its own counsel the way it always had. The cabin sat in its fold of the slope, with the fire banked and the shelves organized and the books leaning against each other on the top row with a gold coin between them. They'd be back before the first frost. They both knew it. And knowing it, not as surrender, not as obligation, but as the simple forward-facing fact of two people who had chosen each other with full information about the cost, was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of thing that, once you had it, you understood all the years before it differently, not as wasted, not as wrong. Just as the particular path that had been necessary to arrive at this specific morning, this specific trail, this specific choice, made freely by two people who had earned the right to make it. The mountain watched them go. It would be watching when they came back. It would be the same mountain, cold and vast and honest in the way only indifferent things can be honest, and they would be changed in ways they couldn't yet measure. That was fine. Change that came from choosing was the only kind worth keeping. They followed the trail down.
The lever and leave.
Where's Megan?
She's busy.
That's okay, I'm still busy doing stuff. I'm gonna finish at a reasonable time. Fuck! Alright. Looks like it's Daddy and Zerty again. You've both been summoned. Alright, Ben, get in here.
Just Alt F4, motherfucker.
Cause it's cheating.
My computer
Welcome to
exploded.
your first day on the job.
Well,
This is your very own
True.
autopilot ship, where you will eat and sleep for the duration of your contract.
I don't think Chandler wants to play anymore.
yeah, I don't think so.
Make yourself at home. To complete the onboarding process, you will want to check the instruction manual and sign into your ship's computer terminal. We trust you will be a great asset to the company. Great asset to the company. Great asset to the company.
You know what you should play? You should play Getting Over It.
With Bennett Foddy? Should I play that, Ben?
Fuck is that?
That's the name of the game, is it not?
Fuck
Can
is
still play, I just suck. Are we playing this or not, Ben? Do you want to play or no?
that? We did like three runs.
Oh no?
You still want to play?
Okay, we can get off. It's fine.
What else are we gonna play? Though?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So, do you want to play or no? I just closed out the game, but I'll open it if you want to play.
I don't really want to play, but I will.
Okay,
play.
now if you don't want to play, then I'm not gonna force you to fucking play. I could do Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. Nah, fuck that. Fuck that. Maybe one day.
Play Wackle.
I don't want to play Wackle either.
No Wackle.
I don't want to play Wackle, bro. That's
Not
too
that
short.
one game you were gonna play with the
Huh?
Dave the Diver. I played that game before.
I don't want to pay the money that game is asking. Come on, let's play. Let's just do one more run, Ben. Come on. Let's do one more run. One more run, and then I'll play something else.